Prime Minister, at 3 o'clock tomorrow, in view of this fact, tomorrow, Tuesday, will be treated as Victory in Europe Day.
In 1945, Britain emerged from the ashes of World War II with its head held high. Bombed, blooded, but unbroken, the British people had endured and survived. They celebrated in the streets. Union Jacks waved from every house window. There was pride, deep pride in being British. But today, that same flag often sparks debate, not unity. You can even get arrested for flying it nowadays. So how did Britain go from unshakable patriotism to questioning its own identity in just a few short decades? Let's ask some questions and let's try and find out. The end of World War II marked a new chapter for not only the West, but for Britain itself. The whole of Britain stood tall among the victors, and rightfully so. Our brave military personnel had fought against all odds. Therefore, patriotism was natural, because it was earned. The working class felt they had fought for something worth protecting, something their own parents, and themselves in a lot of cases, had previously fought for in World War I. Amazing, iconic institutions like the NHS and the welfare state were born out of a shared sacrifice. During and after the war, the monarchy remained a source of unity. In schools, children sang hymns and hung the flag in every classroom. Being British meant something proud, something clear. Even now you'll hear stories of bombing raids endured while sat in an underground station for hours, or just sat scared in a darkened living room, kids huddled against their trembling parents, praying that the noise would subside and that one of the many screaming bombs wouldn't land on their house. The thing is, you won't hear them moaning. You won't hear them siding for the opposition. It had to be done, they say. If we wanted freedom, if we wanted eventual peace, if we and the next generation and the next and the next wanted to enjoy life how it should be. This was a small sacrifice. But was it? Now we see people taking sides, and it's not always for the Brits. Some side against their own people. But after the initial celebrations of Churchill's win, cracks began to show. The British Empire started to unravel. In 1947, India gained independence. Africa closely followed. The Suez Crisis in 1956 marked a symbolic blow to Britain's global power. The Suez Canal, a crucial waterway for international trade, especially oil from the Middle East to Europe, was controlled by British and French interests, despite being located in Egypt. In July 1956, Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser nationalised the Suez Canal, previously operated by the Suez Canal Company, angering Britain and France. Britain, France and Israel secretly conspired in the so-called Sèvres Protocol. Israel would invade Egypt. Britain and France would then intervene under the pretext of separating the warring parties and securing the canal. In reality, the goal was to regain Western control of the canal and remove Nasser from power. All three, Britain, France and Israel, went ahead and attacked Egypt. Despite initial military success, international condemnation quickly followed, especially from the United States and Soviet Union. The crisis was a wake-up call that Britain no longer acted independently of US approval in global affairs. It marked the beginning of a more rapid decolonisation process, especially in parts of Africa. Prime Minister Anthony Eden, who had championed the attacks, faced intense domestic and international criticism. He resigned in January 1957, citing health issues, though the Suez fiasco was a major reason. The Suez Crisis was a turning point in British foreign policy, demonstrating that Britain was no longer a superpower. It ended any illusions of imperial grandeur and underscored the new order dominated by the US and Soviets. Domestically, it led to political upheaval, and internationally, it humbled a once dominant empire. Meanwhile, industrial decline began to erode working class pride. Cities like Liverpool, Sheffield, and Glasgow, once booming, began to struggle. In some of Great Britain's biggest cities, morale was beginning to dwindle, and opening the borders soon followed. The 1960s brought cultural revolution. Music, fashion, and liberal ideas bloomed, but with change came division. Traditional values were questioned. Patriotism became seen by some as outdated or even nationalistic. It is said by some that the government of the time lapsed its control of the LSD drug. Hippies openly used it. Back then, some psychiatrists even prescribed it for treating mental health conditions like alcoholism and depression. Some think that this was a way of making a huge chunk of the population forget about what was going on behind the scenes. It was that successful that numerous hippie groups protested against war, against our military, and began to side for other countries against Britain. Patriotism began to slide, and hugging trees became a must. When the plan had succeeded, the government outlawed LSD in 1966, and it remains a Class A drug to this day. The 70s brought economic downfalls, blackouts, and widespread strikes. The British way no longer seemed to work. The 3-day week was introduced, actually made law. It is one of several measures introduced in the United Kingdom from 1973 to 1974 by Edward Heath's Conservative government to conserve electricity, the generation of which was severely restricted owing to industrial action by coal miners and railway workers. Folk sat for hours with no electricity. Candle sales went through the roof. The economy shifted from manufacturing and heavy industry like coal, steel, and shipbuilding to a service and finance driven economy. Former industrial heartlands experienced massive overnight decline, while London's financial sector boomed. The British life for some wasn't the vision they had when their husbands and sons had returned after the war. Some even started asking who had actually won the war. People were worried. By the 80s, Margaret Thatcher tried to reignite national pride, especially through the Falklands War. Rumours surfaced that the Falklands War was a stage, and she had known of the invasion 3 months previous but had failed to act. This is unproven and is just a rumour, I think. Was she hoping for a full-scale war? Was she hoping to use this to bring back some pride to the demoralised British population? Would this flip the unemployment levels, which had skyrocketed? No one can say for sure. Personally, I don't think she did, but don't hesitate to tell me in the comments what you think. Nevertheless, social cohesion began to fracture, and the great in Great Britain was obvious to many, now fading. It didn't take them long to activate globalism. It was designed to reshape the world, and boy did it work. Immigration brought richness to British life, but it also raised hard questions about identity. What did it mean to be British now? Was it Queen and country, or diversity and modernity? Multiculturalism became a defining feature of Britain, particularly in its cities. This was not by choice. For some, this new identity felt alien to the one they grew up with. Older soldiers and families from the World Wars struggled to understand the concept. As per norm, the governments ignored them and went ahead anyhow. Outspoken MPs like Enoch Powell warned the British folk of where this could lead if not controlled properly. From the start, and even to this day, some call him racist for his views. Was he? Or was he patriotic enough to worry? Britain has become far more ethnically and culturally diverse due to immigration from former colonies, Europe, and beyond than he would have ever predicted. Cities like London, Birmingham, Manchester, Leicester, and Bradford are now among the most multicultural in the world. The British way of life was being questioned, even tested. What did we do? Nothing. By the turn of the millennium, education had now drastically shifted. British history was no longer Churchill and victories. It now included empire, slavery, and oppression. Important truths, yes, but for some, the balance tipped too far into shame. The British were now having guilt thrown at them. It no longer mattered that the empire had improved the countries. All folk were interested in was how they had treated the locals in a distant history, in a different era. Meanwhile, the mainstream media increasingly spotlighted Britain's flaws: inequality, racism, corruption. Young people were suddenly raised with a critical lens instead of being allowed to grow up. College lecturers began instilling their own beliefs on their students, some covertly and cynically. Pride for the nation became complicated, and being British became something not to be shouted from the rooftops any longer. Schools stopped singing the national anthems in fear of having funding cuts or humiliated in the backstabbing press. Union Jacks were renamed Union Flags, and authorities began asking Indigenous patriots to take down these same flags. The peoples weren't making the complaints, it was the media telling people they had to complain. A new narrative was forming. All of a sudden, as if out of nowhere, being British was a bad thing. Some of the immigrants who had arrived, welcomed, invited, began referring themselves as British Asians and not British. They formed groups to fight back against a nation that had once welcomed them, even as far as to demand compensation. This only enhances divide. It shows some folk that their allegiance, their loyalties, lie elsewhere, which is understandable to think that. Society also began to change, or deliberately nudge words into other meanings. Pride was no longer a word associated with gratification. Gay was no longer to feel happy and joyous, although it is to some, and the list goes on. Emblems from famous jam manufacturers had to be removed. Names of moisturising cream had to be changed, and now even jean commercials are deemed offensive. When a culture or a society of a nation has to bow to the invited newcomers, something is seriously wrong, and yet we still bow to it. It's like we've had something removed, something chopped. How come when a British person visits a different country, they have to abide by their laws, their traditions, but come to Britain and you can demand from the indigenous British to change? Not you. I heard a saying the other day, give an inch, they'll take a mile. Anyone know what that means? Some think all this change is down to Brexit. The Brexit vote didn't cause the divide, it revealed it. One side voted to take back control, the other feared the consequences. Both sides claimed patriotism, but defined it differently. The vote exposed a fractured Britain: North versus South, cities versus countryside, young versus old, rich versus poor. National pride wasn't gone, it was contested. Some wanted to be told what to do by other European nations. Others wanted us, the people, to decide what is good for our country. I mean, at the end of the day, it is our country, right? Or was. Before Brexit, Tony Blair, and I wish I was allowed to say what I really think of him, exploded immigration into Britain. They were entering in droves, and cities and large towns were beginning to be stretched to the limit. An already crumbling infrastructure was pushed, and the inevitable happened. British folk started to become poorer. Cultures began to be eroded. Traditional things that British folk once took for granted were lost. Fish and chips or the Sunday roast were no longer the traditional dish. Curries and kebabs took over. John, Matthew, and Stephen fell out of the top 10 boys' names, while Mohammed entered high up on the list. Obvious signs were there. It wasn't racism, it wasn't hatred toward change, it was the erosion of great traditional British values. Did we act? No. Typical stiff upper lip prevailed, and look at Great Britain now. Agree or disagree? Let me know. So, is Britain really a country that hates itself? Not entirely, I don't think. People still cheer for England in sport. Union Jack clad people still pack the streets for royal events. Some still wear poppies every November. The love for country is still there, but it's quieter more complex, more private. It's as if embarrassment is in the British people's soul. Some fear pride will be labelled prejudice. Some think supporting British values is racist. Others fear silence will be mistaken for shame. And there are a few who are so ashamed to be British, they are willing to virtue signal to hide it. And that, people, is dangerous to our whole society, to our whole existence. Some say and think Britain hasn't stopped loving itself, it's just learning to love differently. The story of this island is still being written, just in a different way. Maybe patriotism today isn't about empire or tradition. Maybe it's about honesty, community, and hope. But one thing's for sure, a country's identity isn't lost in silence. It's lost when people stop caring. It's lost when the wrong people rewrite the history books. And it's lost when a nation thinks even the craziest of changes are acceptable. Ask yourself something. Do you think a question like, what is a woman, would have been tolerated back in the 70s or 80s? No, I don't think so either. It would have been laughed at. I'm convinced talking is what is needed, but it seems even that has gone, or going, hasn't it? You be the judge.